In this video, I'm going to go over anaerobic respiration. This matches up to section 10.3 in your textbook. And anaerobic respiration is also called fermentation. So, as I just said, anaerobic respiration is also known as fermentation. And the point of this process is that since there's no oxygen, the ETC cannot function, the electron transport chain, because there's no oxygen to accept the electrons, in which case the cell is not using up the NADH to recycle the NAD plus back to glycolysis. So fermentation just adds a step after glycolysis to use up the NADH to recycle the NAD plus back to glycolysis so it can keep doing glycolysis to make at least a little bit of ATP. Because remember, glycolysis does make a net gain of 2 ATP. Okay, which I just answered that question. So there's two types of anaerobic respiration. The first is called lactic acid fermentation. And so this is used by animals and some plant cells. It's also used by bacteria. So your cells will use lactic acid fermentation when there's not enough oxygen. Let that bell ring. Okay. And this process ends up producing a byproduct known as lactic acid, which in the past has been thought to be toxic to cells, but there's some new research that shows that it might not exactly be toxic, but that it is responsible for like muscle fatigue and heavy exercise. Okay, so as I just said, that's kind of up for debate as to exactly what role lactic acid plays in muscle fatigue. But if we look at this picture, so this first half of the picture is just glycolysis. You got your glucose, splitting the sugar, creating pyruvate, and you're left with a net production of 2 ATP and 2 NADH. So this second half here is the lactic acid fermentation. And in that case, you change pyruvates into a substance called lactic acid. And that conversion of pyruvate to lactic acid uses up some NADH so that you produce NAD+, which, as we see here, can be recycled back into glycolysis. So that glycolysis can keep going and you can get your 2 ATP out of it. So that is the first type of fermentation. Okay, so again, remember, only 2 ATP produced, the 2 that are produced during glycolysis. So this is less efficient than aerobic respiration, but it's better than nothing. So the second type is alcoholic fermentation. So this is, again, very similar. First half of this is glycolysis. Second half is the actual alcoholic fermentation. So this is a process that's used by yeast and some other cells to that ends up producing CO2 and ethyl alcohol. So glycolysis, same thing, split the sugar, get some ATP out of it, get some NADH, you're left with pyruvate. And then in alcoholic fermentation, you change that pyruvate into ethyl alcohol, which you'll notice the ethyl alcohol only has 2 carbons. So you break off a carbon, and which means that those 2 carbons are released as carbon dioxide. And in this process, you use up the NADH so that the NAD plus can be recycled back and get recharged into glycolysis, and you also get your 2 ATP. Okay? So this CO2 production is why yeast can be used to make bread rise, because they produce CO2 in this process as they are breaking down the glucose, creating some energy, and that CO2 is what causes the bubbles in the bread and causes the bread to rise. Okay? And it does produce the ethyl alcohol as a byproduct as well. Okay. So these processes are particularly important for to humans for different types of foods. So yogurt uses fermentation, production of cheese can use fermentation, bread, like I just mentioned. So these are some important food substances for humans, and all of these are made using fermentation by different organisms. So, summary of anaerobic respiration. This is what occurs when there is no oxygen to cells. It functions to recycle materials, specifically the NAD+, so that more glycolysis can occur and you can produce the limited 2 ATP. And there are 2 types of anaerobic respiration that produce just different byproducts. That's how they're named. So lactic acid fermentation produces lactic acid. The key thing to remember for humans is that it is involved with muscle fatigue in some way, and alcoholic fermentation, which is important for humans because it produces many foods and beverages for humans as well. So that is anaerobic respiration. Pretty quick, pretty easy. It's just something that allows glycolysis to continue to occur and recycling NAD plus back into glycolysis.